Hello world, I've got a pile of records for you today. Aha, Scoundrel Days. The Best of the Doobies, that's the Doobie Brothers, Volume 2. Prince, 1999. And Van Morrison, Astral Weeks. What have they all got in common? Let me tell you, let me put you out of your misery. Number one, these are all very mediocre pressings that I have known. And number two, they're all Warners. I suppose commonality factor number two could be the reason why they're all very mediocre pressings, because they were pressed by Warners. First of all then, what's wrong with them? Let's take these records alphabetically then. Aha, Scoundrel Days, released 1986. It was their second album after Hunting High and Low, which was their most popular album. Contains hits such as Cry Wolf and The Swing of Things and I've Been Losing You. Released at a time when the pre-recorded cassette was the most popular format, and after the mid-80s the pre-recorded cassette kind of dwindled in popularity until, by the time we got to the end of the 90s they just were not a thing. So maybe a reason for this being a poor vinyl pressing might be because it had to sound good on cassette. And so however it was mixed to start with, it had to sound good on cassette, and therefore putting it onto a better format like vinyl, you might be hearing the limitations of the mix. The Doobies, Best of Volume 2, released in 1981, I believe this was. Contains such hits as Minute by Minute and Little Darling I Need You and You Belong to Me, which I thought was a Carly Simon song. I didn't realise until the other day, actually, because I only got this the other day. I didn't realise that Michael McDonald had written it. This comes sort of at the second part of the Doobie Brothers' career. The reason that I have it is because I was watching one of those American guys on YouTube, Shangri-066, something like that. I'll put his name properly up on the screen. He was mending one of these old-fashioned gramophone things with the cassette and the radio and the record player all built into a sideboard. And one of the albums that he brought with him to check it all out on was a very beaten up old copy of What Were Once Habits Are Now Vices, which was their album from 1974. And I thought I liked the sound of that, so I found it on Apple Music. It's available on Apple Music as a remastered, digital remaster thing, and it sounds absolutely amazing and the music's brilliant. So I thought I'll try and find some Doobies on vinyl. I don't have that What Were Once Habits Are Now Vices on vinyl. The only thing I could find in my local secondhand record shop was this album. And it's a bit of a disappointment, really. It doesn't have the guts and the power about it that I'd heard from that 1974 LP with, what's his name, Tom Johnston on vocals. This has got Michael McDonald on vocals. There's nothing wrong with Michael McDonald's vocals. I like Michael McDonald as a vocalist. Even when he performed with Patti LaBelle, it wasn't disastrous. But as I say, this is a very lackluster sounding LP. It doesn't, because it's being played on that thing over there. My Elicit R amp putting 105 watts per channel up it, and those PMC speakers that just doesn't matter how loud you drive them, they sound absolutely fantastic. But in the scheme of things, it's very lackluster. It is like a little mouse squeaking away in a corner. as it has to be said, are all of these albums. Here's another one. Prince, 1999. Now, this one I've got a lot of history with. I first heard this album in 1984 because I'd already got Purple Rain and really enjoyed it. And so the next opportunity that I got 1999, and I got it on a cassette. Because as I say, in the 80s, the cassette was a really popular thing. I had a tiny little mono radio cassette from Woolworths. I don't even know what brand it was. I think it was completely unbranded. Those Warner cassettes were really badly put together. I can't find you an example of one. I don't have most of my cassettes now, but it was just a tiny little picture on the front in a square format with a big black splodge at the bottom, and it just said Prince 1999. And when you opened it up, you got just a track listing and all the "we will cut the brakes of your car if you dare unauthorizedly copy or broadcast the recorded work." So that's all you got with it. No lovely lyrics, no pictures, none of this on the back. All the songs out of order because this is a double and they wanted to use as little tape as they possibly could. So they did it by putting the songs in different orders. Thankfully, because cassettes were the predominant format at the time, there were moves to try and make this very poor sounding medium a bit better. The bandwidth of cassettes, and this is why these pressings on vinyl, I believe, really sound quite bad. The bandwidth of cassette is so limited. The dynamic range, that is the loudest it can be before it distorts and the quietest it can be before it dissolves into tape hiss, is very, very limited, very, very narrow. With tape, the rule of thumb is that the faster it goes round, and studio cassettes can go 15 inches per second, sometimes 30 inches per second. The cassette goes round at 1 7/8 of an inch per second. The wider it is, the more signal you can get onto it. Cassette is tiny, like, just a maybe half a centimetre thin, and it's got to have 2 stereo tracks on it, i.e. 4 tracks on it, 2 going one way to make stereo left and right on side 1, 2 going the other way to make stereo left and right on side 2. But thankfully, they had at least decided, well, let's at least use chrome tape. So that's what my first copy of 1999 came on, i.e. a chrome tape, very thin chrome tape, because they could only be bothered to use one. It would be too expensive to make it a twin cassette with like a double cassette pack. That's too expensive. They wanted to maximize profit above all else. So you got this very thin. I would have thought that to make it viable, they would have used a very thin tape, the kind of tape that they said was thinner than normal to pack into the cassette housing when you were using C120 tapes. V Westlife did a video about it, and really, although there was nothing wrong with C120 tapes, people did say you were better off avoiding them, and I think it would have been that grade of tape that would have been used for 1999, but a chrome tape at least. The chrome tapes were programmed to play at normal equalization setting. Chrome is better off in the treble. It gives you a much better treble response, a bit more energetic, but quite a limited bass response. Whoever mastered that album, i.e. made the final mix from the multitracks into 2-channel stereo, off to be cut for record or copied, duplicated for cassette, will be thinking most people that play the cassette will be playing it on something as insignificant as mine, because these are kids. If the bass is too heavy, it's going to cause all the plastics that these things are made of to buzz, the speakers will distort, the treble end will shriek because they won't have had Dolby on them. So that would have been a consideration. I'm not going to say that that would have been their only consideration though, because once these things get onto record, cheaper record players were slightly more expensive than cheap cassette decks. Cheap cassette decks were really cheap in those days. But your record player as well, with that ceramic cartridge on it, it's going to shriek in the treble. It's going to distort in the bass, even with the proper RIAA curve applied to it, which would have been done after the mastering. So I got this and played it, and it sounded really thin and nasty on my unbranded Woolworths radio cassette. The next upgrade to my hi-fi was a little Matsui stereo radio cassette with very dubious mechanism in there, really obnoxious levels of wow and flutter, very limited treble. I think it was something like 100 hertz in the bass, which is really not very low at all, to maybe 6 kilohertz. So in other words, very mid-range heavy. And I was, in a sense, quite pleased, whatever, because it was in stereo. And I'd never heard stereo before. I'd kind of convinced my mum that because I'm about to start my degree in music, I ought to really have something decent to play tapes back on. So when my first grant check came through, that's what I did. Wandered down to Curry's and bought a sharp back-to-back cassette recorder thing. It was about £99. And when I brought it back home and played it, and of course, yeah, I mean, I'd read all what hi-fi and everything, and you should be doing proper listening tests and, you know, whatever, they don't let you do that in Curry's. It actually made, funnily enough, a very good fist of playing cassettes. That mechanism was a lot more sturdy, nowhere near as wowy and fluttery as the Matsui had been. And so I thought I was in audiophile heaven, and I put this cassette on of 1999. It was just a bit unremarkable. Much later in life, I got the CD of 1999. You know, and CDs are supposed to be much better and all, aren't they? But it was very unremarkable. The first time you ever buy a CD and play a CD on something when all you've been listening to is cassettes on cheap players, you put a CD on and you are bowled over because the thing doesn't wow and flutter and it doesn't crackle and pop and scratch, and it's got a very silent thing so it doesn't hiss in the background. So yeah, in all those ways, but the actual mix that was being played on these things was unremarkable. Just want to cut in here. I found my CD of 1999 and look at the cheek of what they're saying on here. The music on this compact digital disc was originally recorded on analog equipment. We have attempted to preserve as closely as possible the sound of the original recording. Because of its high resolution, however, the compact disc can reveal limitations of the source tape. The absolute cheek of that. Don't blame us that this CD sounds so terrible. It's the equipment's fault that we used originally. And in fact, that is not the case. The equipment that they use was well capable of producing a really clear, upbeat, vibrant, dynamic recording. They just didn't want to. The considerations of the mixing engineers and Warner's themselves was, let's try and do something as cheaply as we can that will play acceptably well on a cheap cassette player, that won't sound too bad on vinyl. So when they were preparing mixes, they weren't necessarily creating the most high fidelity ones. And with these two albums in particular, what bass that there is, and it is audible. For example, on Scoundrel Days, a song like Cry Wolf has got quite an insistent bass line on it, but it's evident, particularly if you listen in on AirPods, for example, that any deep rounded overtones, those sort of overtones that ground the music, are just not present, and it's only upper bass that you can hear. So a song like Astral Weeks from Van Morrison, yes, there's bass present, there's obviously bass present, but as soon as that bass has come in, it comes in somewhere sort of towards the end of the first stanza of the song, something like that, and it's quite pronounced. But as soon as the mix gets going, the instruments all start coming in together, it just dissolves. It just sounds lightweight compared to a song like Bermondsey Street by Patrick Wolf. And you could argue, oh, they didn't know how to get good bass frequencies on records in those days. They did. There are some absolutely wonderful pressings from the 70s, late 60s even. I happen to think that Abbey Road is such a superb pressing. It wasn't always Warner's that were doing it, although I believe they were the biggest culprit, and the ones that sound, once they did get onto CD, the ones that sounded so unremarkable. This is Capitol Records, for example, really not known for their quality. The Beatles' Capitol Records, compared to the English pressings, are just shoddy. This is Bob Seger, the Silver Bullet Band. It's one of those albums in my double LP Dilemma video. I talked about records, double LPs, that had some odd side numbering, and this is one of them. This is side 2, so you would expect that side 1 would be there, but it's not, it's side 3, because the other record here is side, sorry, that's side 1, upside down, and side 4. And this is a very, very underwhelming thing as well. These records, though, had a great advantage because they were so limited in their bandwidth. DJs on the radio could actually put them through whatever algorithm. Half the work's been done for them. They could put them through whatever algorithm, and you could turn these things up to be loud. Because, as I say, any offensive buzzy bass or any potential for buzzy bass has been reduced. Any potential for shrieky treble has been reduced. They will make sort of quite a good fist for themselves if you turn them up a bit. But as I say, the whole experience is still a bit flat. This thing I've had for a few years now. I haven't heard a record player yet that's grabbed this by the scruff of the neck and booted it into the middle of next week and played it the way that you would expect that this live gig by Bob Seger would have sounded like. You know, it's just very flat, lifeless. And, you know, the fact that it is one of those side 1 and side 4, side 2 and side 3 things means that it's been designed for an auto-change record player. Those auto-change record players with no great shakes. Some were good. Duel, for example, did a very good one, but they were just not very. As I say, the cheap cartridges, the poor equalization, even if you use an amp that is correctly designed for ceramic cartridges. And that's kind of where I'm going to leave it today. I will come back to you with the absolute antithesis of a label, that you can pick up a record that is pressed on that label, or even play a tape that has been pressed on that label, and it sound absolutely remarkably good, and completely the opposite of how Warner's sounded. But my summation is that these things, they're indistinct in the bass, they're fluffy in the treble, very, very limited dynamically, and I believe that it was on purpose so that people could say, well, yeah, my records and tapes are getting worn out, don't sound as good as they should be, I should get a CD player. And once you've got that CD player, you'll be so bowled over by the huge dynamic range and the almost zero wow and flutter that you'll have forgotten that actually the thing that made you decide that you needed a CD player was still exactly the same. Remember to like, subscribe, share if you dare, consider a super thanks if you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.